This is a partnership with the National Academy of Public Administration. This is our Tanner Day. And what we're focused on today is the future of citizenship and public service. We had a wonderful presentation this morning from the Honorable Governor Christy Todd Whitman, the former governor of New Jersey, who shared with us her thoughts and perspectives on the future of public service and some of the challenges in citizenship confronting our nation today. And she gave some great insight into how we might think about moving forward, especially within our individual communities. After that session, we had the great privilege of hearing from 4 different individuals, Dave Sulik of Booz Allen, Professor Andrew Cohen from the History Department, Andy Maxwell from the City of Syracuse, and Professor Tina Nabachi, talking about what the public service workforce of the future looks like. It is now my great pleasure to welcome you to our noontime panel. And starting on my immediate left, let me introduce Dustin Brown from the Office of Management and Budget, Terry Gerton, the President of the National Academy of Public Administration, Sean O'Keefe, Professor in the Department of Public Administration and International Affairs, and Governor Whitman. And we're going to begin today by really looking at this issue of thinking about the challenges and the future of public service, but particularly through the lens of governance, and how some of the things that we heard in the morning sessions, how that might be impacting us as we move forward. I'll serve as timekeeper and moderator, and I'm David Van Slyke, and it's my great honor to be the Dean of the Maxwell School. So let me begin with a question for each of you. We hear oftentimes the word government and governance used interchangeably. Sometimes we hear this idea of governance talked about as a system of government where institutions function according to democratic processes and norms, both internally and in their interaction with other institutions. Those terms can get us really hung up, though. We hear people throw them around quite casually, and then when we talk to the average person in the public, they say, well, what's the difference? What does this mean? So maybe we can start, Dustin, with you in very practical terms. Why have we moved to this of talking about everything that government does through a lens of governance?
Great. Well, first of all, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me back. Always great to get back to Syracuse and the Maxwell School. Remember my time here very fondly, and so it's great to be able to reconnect with everyone. In my role at OMB, I view a big part of my job as trying to influence leadership behaviors and activities across the most senior levels in government, whether that's our 3,000 kind of political appointees or 7,000 career SES. A lot of our focus is on that role of leadership, and I really think those things are intertwined in terms of governance and leadership. And a lot of it comes back from our perspective on what are the problems that leaders are focused on and trying to solve, because that really does orient the organization's behaviors. And I think in Washington in particular, we see a lot of senior leaders focus most of their time and attention on kind of the urgent. That's primarily around communications, budget, legislation, policy. And I think if you look at high-performing organizations as a general rule in the private sector or elsewhere, they are focused a lot more on bottom-line results and implementation. And I think one of the gaps that I've certainly been dedicated to trying to close is how do we get more senior leadership time and attention focused really on improving those outcomes that citizens expect of their government, and moving kind of more and more of leadership focus on those types of issues, not just kind of the firefighting or the day-to-day kind of urgent items that take up most of our time. So we've been focused on building out kind of a performance framework and a management framework that tries to incentivize kind of proven leadership techniques. And I think if we do that well, we have a chance at improving kind of the governance and systems that our institutions rely on to make decisions, to solve problems that ultimately wind up yielding better performance for taxpayer dollars.
Great, thanks so much. Terry?
Well, the question of government and governance, I think, actually runs through the Academy's history, and fellows have been on one side or the other about whether the National Academy of Public Administration should be working on government or governance. And I think of them sort of as two sides of the same coin. Government is the institutions, and governance is the rules by which those institutions work. And I think where we struggle is that the rules of the game are getting more and more complex. The situations that our government has to deal with are more and more complex, to the point where there's not a single problem that the government faces that can be solved by a single agency. All of our solution sets have to be co-produced. So we need leaders and we need rules that facilitate that co-production across agencies. We also need all of the different levels of government. The federal government can't solve any problem all by itself. It can sort of set common conditions, but it relies on its partners at the state and local level to be able to actually deliver the solution down to the citizen. So we not only have to span sort of horizontal agency boundaries, but we have to span vertical layers of government. And then the government itself, at all of those levels, really doesn't have the total capacity to deliver the solution. So we have state partners and we have non-state partners. We have the private sector and nonprofits, as we just talked about before. So the governance process that now has to span horizontally, vertically, and maybe diagonally, so we get all of our dimensions in there, is just much more complex. So to be able to be effective, we have to have a government system, a governance system that addresses all of those and sets the capacity, creates the capacity for us to be successful in service delivery.
Great, thanks so much. Sean?
Not very much of exactly the same definition. I think that Terry just offered, that there is a huge distinction, and it often gets confused if you're not careful, that governance really is very much about the oversight of the process as well as how the policy is organized for the purpose of consideration in that oversight process and however it's approved. And government is the institution by which it is delivered. And the constant challenge always occurs on, I think most dominantly, on the governance end of the equation. Just to build on what Terry's, I think, very astute observations yielded, that when there's a confusion between who's responsible for actually serving up the policy proposal, the very proposition of where you're going, whether it's the CEO of a company or the secretary of a department or the administrator of an agency or any other function that may be required from a leadership standpoint to frame what is the policy objective you're after. And then those who are in the position of trying to oversee that to determine its efficacy, not only as a policy, but in terms of also how well it's implemented, how effectively it's implemented, of looking at that overall government and institutional frame of how that's delivered. I think that's typically where the greatest challenges come to bear, is a confusion over whose role is what. And sometimes there's a propensity on one side or the other to try to subsume the responsibilities of the other. And that's where the greatest tensions, I think, occur. The issue of how government then as an institution delivers on those policy choices is also an oversight function, but it is one that says nothing about exactly what other institutional frameworks you would employ to actually deliver on those, be it a public institution, a private organization, a nonprofit, any other NGO relationship that you may define. Those are all methods and means by which that can be carried out. And its efficiency, effectiveness, and utility is what that governance structure is there to evaluate. So I think that's a very crisp determination and difference between those two fields.
Great, thanks so much. Governor?
Well, I would agree with that assessment. I mean, governance is leadership to me. Governance is leadership. Government is the structure that allows you to deliver. And I would also start.
Can you turn
Your mic,
You
please.
turned it on.
Oh, it is.
It's green.
There you go. Let's go.
That's on.
Sorry.
I didn't change anything. It was green. I said, governance
She's
is
right.
leadership, and government is the structure that allows you to deliver that leadership when you're talking about it from the perspective that we're using today. I would also say that as you look at the problems which, it's great to think that we live in the most complicated time. I would venture to say that probably back in the 1700s, they thought it was pretty complicated then too, and certainly during the Civil War, we were facing bigger problems. At least we haven't had any senator bash another over the head yet on the floor of the Senate, but that's a possibility these days. It hasn't happened yet. But I would also look at it as we try to analyze it, not from the top down as much as Terry, you were sort of saying, but implying, but from the bottom up. Because frankly, it is at the most local level that you've got to deliver. Mayors and city councils have got to deliver. And I've always maintained you also only have 24 hours in a day. I don't care who you are. And for a mayor or for a local council person, everybody knows your telephone number. And they expect you to answer that phone when they call and their garbage wasn't collected at 10:30 and it's supposed to have been, it wasn't collected till 11, it was supposed to have been collected at 10:30. They expect you to do something about it. And the higher you go up in the terms of the number of people you represent, the less they reach out directly, but they still reach out directly. And your responsibility is, if you're in the executive branch, is actually to deliver. And you expect the government that's serving under you, the structure that's under you, to be able to help you to deliver that. Your responsibility, from my mind, is to set the overall goals, to set what needs to be accomplished, to ensure that the government structure has the resources that it needs to be able to deliver those goals, whether it is fiscal, when we'll argue with OMB over what really is the priority for an agency, or whether it's manpower, or whether it's a knowledge. And we're in a state of flux right now as to the type of knowledge that we need, because there's so much out there, and not all of it is relevant, but there's a lot that's clouding up people's ability to sort through that. And that's where the leadership and the governance really comes in, that has to be there as a government structure. The government cannot function on its own without the governance.
So the president of NAPA teased me that I had created a series of questions that felt like defending one's master's thesis. So here comes the second thesis question. So some commentators suggest that governance challenges relate to efforts to improve credible commitments, to shared responsibility, to address difficult problems. And sometimes that can involve increasing the amount and diversity of public participation. It can be efforts to promote transparency, or it can take the form of developing new processes and mechanisms for how organizations work together to solve complex problems. Sometimes that can happen through technology, as we heard from Mr. Sulik in our last session about machine intelligence, artificial and automated learning. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what do you see as the governance challenges facing the United States that should be our highest priorities? And what do you think the implications are for how the public service might respond, given that we talked about public service in the morning sessions quite broadly?
So sure, I'd pick up on some of the comments, in particular Terry's around the horizontal and the vertical. I think it's a really helpful framing, and I think we do have a horizontal challenge in that we have horizontal problems in vertical organizations, and we have very few people whose job it is to actually rationalize that system. We have 84 homeless programs. We've got dozens of job training programs, and nobody really is accountable every day for waking up kind of thinking about how these programs could better work together to solve the problem. So I think that's a classic one that has gotten actually worked over time as you have kind of increasing numbers of programs kind of trying to do similar things. And then the second is vertical. I mean, the fact that we have, I think at one point somebody counted 17 management layers between the secretary of VA and a nurse in a VA hospital. That is a major vertical challenge in the kind of size and complexity that is the federal government. So, when I look at the things I've seen work really well in government, I associate myself with the comments in the earlier panel about we need to do a better job telling our story about where we are successful. One of my favorites is around veterans homelessness and some of the work that has been done there. Early on in the last administration, the Secretary of VA set a goal to end veterans homelessness. Now that's a great thing to say, but how are you going to get it done, right? What are you going to get done in the next 2 years What are you going to get done every 3 months? And do you have a framework that actually brings all the right people to the table to do that? And do you even have a definition and a measurement system? VA was measuring homeless veterans one way. HUD was measuring it a different way. So they actually had to first reach agreement on what the baseline is that we're going to use, right? Then the leaders from both organizations, to pick up on the leadership point again, really made a commitment. On a very regular monthly basis, we're going to meet with our teams to understand who's doing this well, who's not, and how we spread the adoption of practices and evidence-based interventions like housing first that actually have shown to make a difference on this problem. And one of the great anecdotes that came out of this work that the HUD and VA teams really were doing, and they were engaged at the local level as well, who were all kind of integrated into these kind of stat sessions using data, is they found certain cities were falling behind. Houston in particular was. And the reaction from kind of the career ranks was, well, we give out the grants. We don't really have a way of influencing how Houston spends the funds. And the leadership that was sitting around the table, Secretary Donovan and Deputy Secretary Gould said, why don't we jointly write a letter to the mayor showing and telling him that he's falling behind and here's why, and we'd love to help. And they did that. The mayor set a goal to house 100 homeless veterans within 100 days and put in place strategies that were based on some of the latest evidence. And Houston, a few years ago, reported they functionally have ended veterans' homelessness in the city of Houston as a result of all of these things finally coming together and building on a lot of extraordinary work. So I do think it's possible, and I have lots of other kind of great examples of where government has worked along these lines to really make a difference. But it does take process, it takes focus on implementation, leadership, data, all kind of coming together to really see the kind of gains that I think we all would expect.
Governor?
Well, I would almost start with the leadership part of that. It's absolutely true. We've got to break down the silos.
Yeah.
That's been one of the biggest obstacles to problem solving in the government structure. And that takes the governance, the leadership to say, we've got to understand that what one part of the government does affects the other part. I mean, we had it at EPA, certainly between water and air, and I like to mix those up. I wanted someone who was an expert in water to head the air division and vice versa, because I wanted them to understand what's in the air comes up down here and it ends up in our water. And for the water people to understand, they've got to care about what emissions are like. And that takes, it takes follow-up. It takes more than just a sitting down at the very beginning. We did this in New Jersey. There is an organization that has a governor's leadership, puts on a program for government new governors coming in. And it's about, you have to bring the whole cabinet together and sit down together to talk about how you interrelate with one another. But if you don't have the follow through on that, it all breaks down. Because it takes it in order to, it's going to be a partnership at the end of the day, and partnership with the different levels of government. But if you haven't set up the structure that has blown away a lot of those lines that prevent people from talking to one another or learning the same language and starting to appreciate what the other side does, you're just not going to succeed. And we've seen examples of it after 9/11. When we were doing air quality monitoring and trying to put it out to the public, we realized that the city was doing monitoring, there was a hospital doing monitoring, there was a university. And everybody was monitoring for slightly different things. Well, to pull that all out to the public didn't give them anything. I mean, that didn't mean it was all gobbledygook to them. So it took us 10 days, but we finally got to a point where we had real-time data that was harmonized. And that took working with all the different sections to say, okay, what's our terminology? What are you really measuring for? And getting it all in the same place so people had apples to compare, so it meant something to them. But too often we get caught up with our acronyms and our way of doing things, and we forget that the average person hasn't a clue. It's not the most important thing in their life. It's not what they spend their lives doing. So really we've got to concentrate on that, start with, I believe, the leadership that's going to break down the silos and follow up, not just a one-time, let's all get together, hold hands, and we'll make everything better, but understand that we've got to drive that home every day and have accountability that goes along with it, because accountability does become the final arbiter of whether or not you've been successful.
Well, I want to go back to the co-production of solutions here. The Academy's released 2 reports this year. One is No Time to Wait, Building a Public Service for the 21st Century, and the other is an anthology of essays on building a senior executive service for the 21st century. And this co-production theme runs through the whole suite of the analysis that these problems are getting harder and harder, and that the difficulty, the complexity is magnified by our 24/7 media cycle. So it's almost always a crisis, and we need leaders who can solve the problems across the spectrum. But I'm also struck by Tina's comments when she kicked off her panel, and she ran through a long list of characteristics that the modern public servant leader needs to have. And I think we have to acknowledge that people aren't just born that way, right? That sort of it's a happy accident these days when we have a leader in public service who actually has the facility and the capacity to work across all of these domains. And even the best training programs for master's graduates don't graduate somebody who has the full suite. And so what we're missing, I think, is a commitment to lifelong learning and training of our public service leaders. I mean, I'm a product of the military officer training system. It's not perfect, but I went to supply school before I became a supply officer. I went to the company commander's course before I became a company commander. You know, there's a sequential anticipation of training requirements, and we don't have anything like that in the public service, where either an individual could opt onto a leadership track or could be nominated for a leadership track, and at every level, they get training on project management, on IT management, on financial management, on the current leadership theories, so that as they assume more and more senior positions, they're prepared and trained, and we're not surprised that they're successful, because I think that's sort of where we are now. It's just good luck that you find a good leader, as opposed to intentionally training people. And I think if we had that, it would also help us with recruitment and retention, where people could see that there's a leadership track. Not everybody has to want to be on it, but for those who do, that there's an intentional investment in success and leadership across the lifetime, so that we build leaders who can co-produce solutions, not just across the federal level, but even rotationally back and forth between federal, state, and local.
Thanks so much. Sean?
One of the challenges of being a cleanup on this is whether to describe this as, yes, I concur in everything that's been said, but just not everybody has said it yet. You know, and I don't want to go there. Instead, let me take a slight different bent to this that's embedded in your question. It was part of the phraseology of shared responsibility. This was an interesting, you know, we just going to talk about that and move right through it, but it is a big piece of this equation, because in so many ways culturally, we've spent the last generation or so debating the question of citizen rights. And there's another part that goes to that, dealing with citizen responsibilities. And part of that is who is engaged to be part of that governance structure and within the government entities to carry that out, that in turn really reminds not only everybody within that cohort, but also broader citizen engagement, that yes, there are rights, these are the ones that ought to be protected, these are the aspects we really need to work our way through, but also there are certain responsibilities we have to engage. And I think Governor Whitman's comments earlier this morning really just gives us a stark picture of the level of real engagement that as citizens we have in this process relative to many other democracies around the world. We've got a long way to go. We've still got more to come, and maybe the upside of what we're seeing in the present environment is one in which there is now an uptick in the overall citizen engagement. These folks are hearing, that's not right. I don't like that view, or I do like that view and I want to see it further perpetuated. But the other part of the question I think that was posed here most succinctly, Dave, was a question of exactly what are those governance challenges going forward. And I think if in addition to the systemic issues I think that's been discussed here by colleagues on the panel, I think the two areas that will dominate any level of service delivery, policy development, whatever, regardless of whether it is local in its orientation or national in its focus or international in its context, are two areas that really do have the most amount of coverage in every area is going to be just the emerging issues we see in globalization, as well as the continuing security and redefining of security challenges. First one, I think, has been talked about endlessly in lots of different settings, but there are enormous implications to economic structures, to tax base, to trade, to all manner of things as a consequence of the workforce issues, displacements, economic displacements, as well as every other workforce displacement that globalization challenges pose. In the second area of security, we're seeing that evolving in a dramatic way, certainly in the last 20 years, in terms of how that's definable today, rather than as state actors looking at the wide range of threats that can be more defined, not just as national security, but homeland security, law enforcement, the whole range of issues that we're reminded of daily of exactly what this requires. And that's where the responsibility part comes back in again. And I think it's one that really does focus on, we've got to look at what how we help connect those various elements that are just seemingly disparate and connect them to those broader governance challenges to drive home that larger message.
It's a great segue to my next question for you. One of the things that many say confronting both the United States and the broader world are the challenges in human security. And yet, as a term, it's a broad and expansive term, but it can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. It often can mean economic security, health security. It can mean environmental security, water and food security, political security, community security. Then there's the whole issue that you just addressed, national and homeland security, and increasingly cybersecurity. The challenge with security, however we define it, but let's just use kind of a broad, expansive term like human security, is that it absolutely requires co-production, as Terry was saying about other policy areas. And yet there are strong incentives against engagement by some of the actors who have the best technology, the greatest expertise, and the logistics on coordination. If Equifax had not had the size of the breach that it did, we would not have heard about the Equifax breach. Every single day there's a cyber intrusion. Every day someone is affected, but they're not hundreds of millions of people affected. And yet, for us to solve some of these governance challenges requires working with others. So my hard question to you is, we can talk about this in terms of using terms like it's important to collaborate. But how do you actually operationalize that? How do you actually bring parties to the table? Especially parties that maybe don't have strong incentives to collaborate, or at least not with government. And even civil society, where there are nonprofit organizations that say, I'm very concerned about water security, but air and the quality of air has very little bearing on my day-to-day life. I'm really about clean streams. How do we do that? Governor, I know that you need to leave very soon for your plane, so why don't you go first on this?
Well, again, it comes back to leadership. It comes back to how you frame those issues and make it mean something to the average person, to make it relevant to them as to why they should care, and relevant to the people in your organization. I mean, the best definition of leadership was Dwight Eisenhower's, which is it's getting people to do what you want them to do because they want to do it. Because of all that implies behind it, it means you've got to understand why it's important to do what you're doing and why, therefore, it should be important to them. And if you can't articulate that, if you don't understand yourself why this thing is important to accomplish or this goal is important to accomplish, it's very hard to bring anyone else to the table to do that with you. And you've got to be able to do that. You've got to be able to get other people to understand it's in their best interest and that they want to participate in this because that gives them a voice in the outcome and how it is going to be handled, because everybody has a very different perception of how much they're willing to give up, for instance, in their privacy in order to be part of today's economy. And what do we allow? We like to be able to interact with everybody, but I don't really like the idea of being followed everywhere. And yet I know perfectly well with my iPhone, I'm being followed. I mean, I could be followed anywhere. You mentioned Equifax, but look at Yahoo. And the thing about the Yahoo breach is and the same with Equifax, they'd known for a period of time. And I love the fact that Yahoo now gets out there and says, well, change your password. And you want to say, this has been going on for 6 months. I haven't changed my password because you didn't tell me I had to change my password. I mean, not that I could remember a password if I could change it every 5 minutes anyway, but that's another problem. I mean, that really is a problem for people. They won't change their password every 5 minutes because do you write it down on a piece of paper where someone might find it? Do you put it under some kind of sneaky title in your address book? In order to get people to participate and be willing to take the time, first of all, we have to figure out how do we make it as easy for them as possible, but we make it as clear to them as to why it's in their best interests to support this kind of an effort. And if you can't convince them of that, then you've lost at the very beginning.
Dustin?
Well, the thing I think we've found that has worked well is absolutely the leadership point, but you got to also make it somebody's job to be responsible for the overall problem and coordination. I don't know how many different interagency meetings and task forces. I think HHS once developed a list of every single interagency task force or working group that they were on, and it went for page after page after page after page. And these are groups that traditionally meet every quarter or every 6 months or something of that sort of cadence. And there's always a lot of great discussion and dialogue about all these great opportunities that we could do more with less and make more progress if we only work together. And they all go back to their day jobs, right? And then that conversation just happens at such a level of infrequency, you never really see as much gains from it as you would want. So one of the things that I've really focused on over the last 4 or 5 years in particular is getting people and resources that can be dedicated to funding and cross-cutting solutions. So I worked with Congress about 3 years ago to establish a new $15 million cross-agency goal fund that the OMB director can control to actually give resources to agencies explicitly for cross-cutting opportunities that can't be funded in any one individual agency's budgets. Now, that's not new appropriations. We have to pass the hat around to all the different agencies to contribute into it, but still, it's a resource that actually kind of puts our money where our mouth is, so to speak. And one example of something we're funding out of that is work that was started in the last administration that is actually continuing on with using the same framework in this administration to overhaul the infrastructure permitting process. This is something that has received pretty bipartisan support in terms of 30 different federal agencies have responsibilities. The timelines can vary dramatically for dams, bridges, roads. And nobody really has ever been responsible for the end-to-end process before. And so it's been very frustrating to project proponents, frustrating to agencies as well, and state and local governments to not have better visibility. So we now have a statutory framework that we worked with Congress, Senator Portman in particular on, that got bipartisan praise, not just from the Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable, but Natural Resources Defense Council came out in support of it as well, because we did work kind of across all different stakeholders in CEQ and NEC internally within the administration to put in place more transparency into place. And we now have a 10-person team, and Congress funds it. That'll be ramping up even more, whose full-time job is to basically unlock barriers that exist between agencies, not just in Washington, but actually going out into the field and having an escalation path to resolve interagency disputes and issues and look for increased coordination up front. That we're already seeing some signs is producing major savings. That small, few $100,000 investment in standing up that central team already had produced a gain of a $300 million financing kind of benefit to one individual project by accelerating the timeline through greater upfront coordination. So these stories are there. It's possible to do it with the right vision, with the right focus. We do a really good job keeping these success stories quiet, I've found, in the federal government, and make sure that the failures are publicized on the front page. But I do think there is a lot of momentum building around some of these. There's still seeds that are starting to kind of shoot through the ground and are going to take some kind of care and feeding to continue to see them grow. But I think there is a model that's in place that the Hill and agencies and outside stakeholders are starting to kind of understand it is possible, but it does take really persistent, consistent kind of focus to really make sure you see it all the way through.
I just wanted to second that, how important it is to have one person, as the vernacular goes, who has the buffalo chip for ensuring something happens. But I would also say the other part of that that's very important is you've got to have a very clear understanding of where you're starting in order to know why you want to go where you're going. When I got to the Environmental Protection Agency, in which something we'd done in the state of New Jersey, is what was the state of the environment? How much did we still have to clean up? What had actually gone on before? There was no such report card. There never had been. No one had ever looked at the status of our waters, at the status of our air, of the brownfield sites or Superfund cleanup. And you've got to establish that base. And then you have somebody who is responsible for breaking down, because certainly within the federal government, and to a lesser, but still there in state government, are those barriers that actually prevent agencies from talking to one another and sharing data and collaborating in the way that they would like to do to get a job done, because most civil servants are there to get their job done, and they will do it any which way you want them to do it, as long as they think that's what you want to do and they understand it. But it's really important to have that person who is going to follow up and say, okay, this is the goal we set. Have we done it? Have we measured it? Did we know where we started from? Because you can't know if you've gotten there or not if you don't know where you start from. And so many times we just pick a great idea out of the air and try to run with it without really knowing, is this the right one to do? Is this based on facts that we have determined on previous analysis of a particular issue, and is this the way to approach it? We've got to form that base, start that with that base, and then have the person who's in charge of seeing it through till the end.
Governor, thanks so much for those comments, and thanks for the extra benefit of staying through our morning and not only joining us last night, but staying through the panel today. Thanks very much.
The panel was fascinating, and thank you very much for having me invited.
Absolutely.
Having invited me. I turned it off. I did.
Thanks, Governor. Good to see you. Nice to see you.
Sean, your perspective?
I think your elegant term, human security, is really a neat, all-encompassing descriptor of what we're talking about here. I mean, some of the challenges of trying to work through that full range of what is, when you think about it, whether it's national security or it's homeland security, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's cybersecurity, whatever it is the classic definition of a public good. It's the only aspect that does indeed provide at some level security for the citizenry, and it doesn't preclude anyone from benefiting by that particular advantage. And so as a consequence, how you actually deliver on that almost calls for an imperative that there be a collaborative model, because you're looking for the greatest expertise, the best focus, the whatever, however you want to define the elements of, as Governor Whitman said, how do you define success? I mean, what is it, what you're trying to achieve, and what is the state of where you are right now? That's what you have to begin with, and then ultimately come to closure on what is the best and most efficacious way to accomplish that task. And that opens up a wide range of opportunities when viewed that way. The issue of whether or not it is a inherently governmental function, or it almost becomes irrelevant. The citizenry is sitting back saying, I want to be sure that coverage is as good as I can hope for. And as a result, that's the responsibility that the public service has to figure out exactly how do you deliver on that particular objective, and do it in a way that pulls together the very most effective ways across the board. Those are two very different kinds of functions and two very different kind of challenges to look at that call for the level, I think, of just public management expertise that we've been debating here during the course of the morning.
So Terry, before we go to the audience for questions, how can the National Academy help? I mean, there are 850 fellows of the Academy. They come from all across the U.S. and in some cases across the world. They are individuals who have spent their entire careers in the public sector, individuals who have never spent any time in the public sector as a, quote unquote, the debate we had this morning, a government paid a worker, but they perhaps, as Dave Sulik has, worked entirely with federal agencies. Where does the National Academy come in here, and how can it help to move forward, not just talk about governance challenges, but action?
Well, I think one of the things we try to do is model this culture of inclusivity, right? If you're going to get a co-produced solution, you've got to get all, or at least as many players as you can to the table. And that means you have to have leaders who understand who should be at the table, right? So that when you're talking about, as an example, a veterans issue, you don't just start with DOD and VA, but you understand that if you're talking about veterans homelessness or employment, you need labor, you need the SBA, you need the Department of Education, you need HUD, you probably need HHS, you need everybody. And so one of the things we try to do as we're tackling these studies is to make sure that the panels are inclusive, that we have folks from academia, that we have practitioners at the federal level, that we include state and local practitioners, that as we do this study, we're reaching out to the private sector to understand what they see from perhaps the outside or maybe the side-by-side, that we talk to constituents and stakeholders to understand how the problem feels from their perspective, and then we try to look at the total intergovernmental system to make sure that we can identify where the glitches are, and what the solution sets look like, because the glitch may appear at the local level but can be fixed at the federal level or vice versa. So you really have to take a systems thinking approach to this. You have to take an inclusive, big tent approach to these challenges and make sure that you're really always asking, what else can we learn? What else can we learn? Who else needs to be here? Who else do we need to talk to?
Can I just build on that real quick? One of the things I've observed about a lot of kind of these government-wide efforts, which I am guilty of several times in my career as well, is that you have solutions in search of problems. We have an idea that, boy, if only we could get this adopted, life will be better, right? I did this focus on reducing the amount of time it takes to hire. Seems like a great goal, right? Everyone can get around kind of reducing it from whatever 150 days at what it was at one point. We have been able to reduce it some, but to be honest, people's satisfaction with the hiring process is as low today as ever. It sits right now of 22 different mission support services like IT and procurement we've looked as rated the most important and the least satisfaction. Right? That is not the quadrant you want to be in. And despite kind of all this efforts to try to re-engineer it and streamline it, it actually hasn't helped managers get the quality of people they want. Right? And so we need to kind of, I think, be a little bit introspective here, too, about how we set up the framework, the goals, the incentives, and whether or not that really is driving the right kind of behaviors across, your rank and file, and are they really accountable for the outcome or for complying with mandates that may or may not actually get you to the goal. So I think as we've been trying to craft a presence management agenda, which will be released in February, we've been really thoughtful about how we set those goals in a way that drive the right incentives.
Great. Sean?
Yeah, very commonly, I think in any level of government, one of the curses that each public organization inevitably deals with is what I would otherwise call the tyranny of stovepipes of excellence, okay? Here you got everybody, this is my field, this is what I do, and that's it, I'm the only one that does it. Or if there's any need for that, you have to come talk to me. Well, that's more just territorial, and it's more human nature to do that. But in a larger sense, what the real challenge of public service demands and public engagement in demands is that there are folks who are constantly looking past that. And that's clearly what you're spending a lot of your time doing, Dustin, and that's outstanding. And that's exactly what I think the National Academy is trying to help facilitate. So you've got exactly the right combination of expertise to do that.
We have about 30 minutes for questions. There are 2 microphones on the left and the right side, so if you would just raise your hand and identify yourself. I think we have 2 right over here to begin with.
I'm Harry Lambright. I work for the Maxwell School. Since we have OMB here and NASA and the National Academy, I'd like to ask this question. I think I heard recently the Secretary of Defense or someone else like that who was in a high-level national security position, he was asked what kept him up at night. And instead of talking about North Korea, he said what kept him up at night, would worry him the most, and it was in terms of good governance, was the inability of the federal government to get budgets on time. Life with continuing resolutions, life where you don't know if you're going to have a budget in a given fiscal year, kept him up at night. From a standpoint of public administration and running government decently, how, and if this is the world we're going to be living in, for at least for the rest of the Trump years, what do we do about this?
So I used to say that, boy, if only we could have a set of management routines and processes that work as well as the budget process, we would be in good shape. I'm not sure that's the right metric anymore, or measure of success, because I think, as you know, the history of management kind of reforms changes every 4 to 8 years, and I think has been a real kind of challenge as well. I think we finally have overcome that, and that this is the first time an administration has used the previous administration's management framework, which is rooted in statute with the Deproprietization Act of 2010. So we now have some continuity on the management side. I know that's not answering your question. On the budget front, you know, I think it's going to require a lot more collaboration between the executive and legislative branch. I would argue that's you know, a question for the legislative branch much more so than the executive branch. Not to say that you know, there isn't obviously a role for both, but you know, our responsibility is to produce a budget, and then Congress's responsibility is to enact it by September 30th. And I think most people in the room know how often we've gotten a budget on September 30th in the last 30 years. So hopefully we can move past that. Things like biennial budgeting and other things I think are intriguing. I do some kind of work internationally with OECD countries and things like that. While I'm not speaking for like the administration's position on that, I will say that most other countries have multi-year budgeting kind of that does help provide them a little more kind of predictability and continuity. That is, we are pretty unique in having annual budgeting.
I can't give you any more detail on the budget process than obviously someone from OMB, but I think the aspect of the budget that worries me is the demographics. And the fact that we as a government are not building our budgets based on demographic reality is actually frightening to me, as we have a declining population, a lower tax base in the future at every level, and yet and a greater demand for our entitlement program, we do not have the political will to execute budgets that reflect that coming reality. So as problematic as it is on an annual basis not to start the year with an appropriation, I'm worried much more about the long term and the sustainability of our fiscal system.
I guess that there are two primary factors that have been enduring challenges in dealing with this very question going forward. The first one is, I think it is fundamentally a whole range of processes that were organized at varying intervals in, doesn't matter, you know, federal, state, local histories of how budgets are developed and formulated and so forth, that over the course of time have become the purpose rather than the budget yield of what you were intending to do. You were trying to make it a reflection of the mechanism to actually fulfill and finance, resource, the policy you just got done articulating. No. Instead, it's become the process is all important. And you can recognize that when you go to an organization and everybody kind of forgets the idea of what you were after, but everybody knows what the mechanics of the process are. And by the time you get done with it, it no longer serves the decision making. It becomes a means unto itself. I mean, the Department of Defense is the paragon of this, okay? It's all about the programming phase, the budgeting phase, et cetera. And everything else is just a big collection of desirements. That every element within that organization wanted to pile on. And it then becomes incumbent upon the leadership to pick and choose among very limited choices over how you want to go do that. And how do you want to organize something that is, fiscally responsible and all the other objectives you're trying to match. It doesn't serve the purpose anymore, and it's a huge hindrance on the leadership by the time it gets to that phase, because it's been built up from everybody's individual desirements. And that's a big challenge. The flip side of this is and the second challenge, is in Congress itself, in legislatures. In any oversight legislative body in which they have the authority to actually enact the means to go finance something, if they lose the view and the absolute imperative that this is an expression of responsibility on our part to do this, and there will be a consequence if we don't enact it in some span of time, then you've lost the march. And that's clearly what's happened on the national agenda level. Is folks members don't see this as of any consequence. What's the difference between September 30th and October 1st? The lights still go on and everything's happening, and what's the big deal? But it creates an enormous amount of churn, inertia, ineffectiveness, constant, withholding on any forward-thinking idea because you just want to get through the next period. That might be a day, a week, a month, whatever it is. And that is the least efficient possible way you can do it. It says, you might be dying tomorrow, so therefore don't play anything big beyond today. And that's not something that's appreciated in terms of how that process, it's so disconnected that it becomes an abstraction. And the very idea, 20 years ago, with most members in Congress, that you would enact something late was an admission of defeat. It was failure. We didn't make it on time. Now, they're going to look at a calendar and remind themselves how far in front or behind or whatever it is. And that's just kind of a historic note, and that's about all. So once you lose those imperatives, and I think that part of that starts with our own insistence on efficiency that as citizens, that's where a lot of this has got to begin as well. And I think some of the rays of hope that Dustin talks about of looking at continuity between and among administrations, maybe there's something that we'll find there in terms of agenda, a focus to this, to put process second and make decision-making first.
I think we have one more there, and we have two questions here in the center.
Good afternoon. First of all, my name is Eric Rogers, and I would like to express my appreciation to Maxwell for permitting people from the community, such as myself, to participate in important events like this. My question is, in the discussion of departments, agencies, et cetera, working together to become more efficient, where does the stakeholder, the people who will be affected by these decisions, where do they come into this process?
In the voting booth. This is the very point I think that Governor Whitman raised earlier today in my mind. She was spot on with this. If there's any singular thing that you could point to say, my vote doesn't count, sure it does. It's your right of expression of what you think is the responsiveness on the part of those who are there to serve the citizenry. And that is absolutely essential. Once we adopt that view, it changes the dimension of this. And folks absolutely want to engage on it. There are a whole array of other approaches to it as well, but I mean, that one's the most definitive. It's personal, that each of us have. And it's a right as well as a responsibility to exercise.
I think one of the new trends that's catching on, at least in the federal government, and certainly as we've traveled around more at the state and local level, is customer-focused design, right? So if you're in a government organization at whatever level and you have the obligation to provide a particular service, understanding your customer, the citizen who's receiving that and what it looks like, so that you design your services to meet that need, not the need that you want to meet, or designing the system so that it's easiest for you to manage. And so that concept is starting to take root, And as it does, and as agencies come together and realize that there are several of us that are serving that same constituent or that same customer, the opportunities to identify overlap and duplication become clearer, and the opportunities to streamline customer service delivery and make it more effective are increasing. So I think as we see the reform plans that, for example, at the federal agency level that they've submitted to OMB, and as OMB is trying to reconcile and referee the different proposals, having customer-centered design at the middle of that will help give it some rationality as to what stays, what goes, what crosses, what doesn't.
Yep. No, and that is a theme that we are definitely seeing in terms of really making sure you've got the customer kind of as the true North Star in terms of thinking about what the boxes need to look like and what where people need to be aligned. One great example that we have is a team called the U.S. Digital Services Group, which really has brought some of the leading talent from Silicon Valley and elsewhere into government. We got about 200 people in that organization, 100 within OMB, 100 within agencies. And they are working on exactly these types of problems in terms of where can we leverage kind of proven private sector technologies and get them more rapidly deployed into government services in a way that better kind of responds to the customer view, and gets rid of things like paper, which we still use way too much of in our government processes, and has both internal benefits in terms of our productivity, but also, maybe more importantly, has tries to reduce the gap between what a citizen experiences when they interact with a private sector company, Amazon or whatever, and what they experience when they go to renew their passport or some of the other kind of functions that they get from the government. I think that is one of the issues around trust is with our institutions is people do see this gap kind of widening between what they experience with government versus what they are seeing in private sector kind of capabilities. So that is something that this group is focused on and has produced really remarkable gains in a relatively short period of time. It's led by a tremendous guy, Matt Cutts, who was one of the first 100 people at Google, and has come in and really continues to recruit amazing people into government that are taking very large pay cuts, I would also say, because the work they're doing is more inspiring and transformative than anything they've done in their private sector. Almost to a person, they come back and say that. They have a lot of work over at VA in particular that's really groundbreaking stuff. So I know that's not exactly an answer, but I do think there is some real hope to get people in government that do think first and foremost about engaging the customer and the citizen and reorient kind of the bureaucracy to focus on that.
We have time for these two questions. I think we have Suzanne here and then the gentleman behind her.
Great, thank you. Suzanne Piotrowski from Rutgers University, and I'm a faculty member, and my research focus is on transparency and open government. So on the topic, governance challenges, so my question to you is, do you think so I should say, in my research, I found a rollback in open government and transparency in this country and in multiple countries. And do you agree with that? Do you think there's a rollback in transparency right now in the federal government? Do you think that's even a problem if there is one, or is that just sort of a normal correction after a management reform that really hasn't produced what it was the hope that it was going to produce?
I have a hard time commenting on like in this administration in particular, whether there's been a rollback. I haven't seen that. I know that a lot of the gains that have been made in terms of our open data national plan and data.gov and making kind of increasing number of data sets more available continues to be a resource. But I'm happy to kind of follow up some more. We are kind of in the process of trying to I think put forward a more proactive strategy around spending and performance transparency in particular. I think that's something that Congress is continually expecting more. There's a number of pieces of legislation that have mandated kind of certain levels of transparency, and we're trying to work through how you rationalize some of those kind of competing bills even at times and really implement them in a way that's cost beneficial, but also really responsive to the type of information that people are interested in. So everything I've seen is there continues to be a commitment to those principles and energy around making that work. But I'm happy to follow up more later there's a particular thing you'd like to talk about.
And I would just add to that, I was very encouraged by the recent report on the Commission for Evidence-Based Decision-Making and how practical their proposals were in terms of integrating administrative data across a variety of programs, so that while we have lots and lots and lots of data, it's not always particularly useful and you can't connect the dots. And so it's complicated when you have to balance data security and privacy against this desire for transparency. But I thought they had some really practical solutions about how to do that, administrative data merge, then kind of protect that administrative data while allowing researchers and government program managers and a whole group of people access to the outcome data so that it could be aggregated and used to evaluate, really evaluate the outcomes of government programs. So I think there's hope, but it's complicated. You know, people don't want their federal data released. You don't want your IRS data connected to your Social Security data, to your health records in public. And so the government has a huge responsibility to make sure that they protect what they have, the very sensitive individual data that they have, while trying to balance that need with transparency.
I think we have a question.
Hi. My name is David Adams with the New York State Division of the Budget. My question is a little more immediate, and the question on the, say, federal government's over-reliance on CR has got me thinking about another point of concern in the near future, which is the Budget Control Act. So my question is primarily for Dustin, if you could give us any insight on how you think this may play out, considering both houses have advanced approached legislation that would bust the defense cap, and the Senate intends to bust the non-defense cap. If you think it might look like the recent bipartisan budget acts, or if there might be a larger deal at play.
You're trying to get me in trouble, aren't you? Answering a question like that in terms of having a crystal ball on what the 18 approps might look like. I really don't have a whole lot to add in on that front, to be honest. But you know, we'll wait and see. And obviously, December is going to be a pretty interesting month for a number of reasons.
Take a powder on that one, I take it.
Yeah. I never know if my bosses are watching back home on the live stream. So.
Well, having been there, okay, previously, I feel liberated to say what I'm thinking, okay, on that. And there is no question that the idea behind the Budget Act, when you go back and trace the history, was driven by two propositions. Number one were the empowerment features. They wanted to stop, you know, behavior on the part of the executive branch, just simply not spending money and trying to make it sound legitimate, that had, you know, a turn-off of programs that were important to citizens, public, broader, you know, objectives. The second part, though, was the Congress actually stepping up to the proposition that we ought to discipline ourselves to do something real fundamental, which is understand the sources of revenue and understand where we're spending it on the way out, and make sure that there's some equation between the two. And that was the notion that's been just about abandoned here in the last, 7, 8 years now. And the very proposition that you could, you knew this was going to go south when folks adopted as a feature to implement decisions something that was described as being part of the 86 amendments to the 85 amendments to the Budget Act to create this thing called sequester. Everybody had to run for a dictionary to figure out what the hell the word meant at the time it was enacted, because it never really heard how this was supposed to work. But this is a mindless process that is driven by a formula that in turn then substitutes for making choices, policy choices, program choices, which is what the Congress is empowered to do. And the executive branch is responsible for serving up as options. And that's what's been abandoned at this stage. So the bigger question of, whether or not everybody's going to adhere to the budget caps and so forth at this stage in the game is simply symptomatic of this larger cultural breakdown that says we don't want to have a relationship between the two functions anymore. And secondly, we want to have something else enforce decisions that are hard. Boy, that's a real governance challenge that is worthy of a referendum all by itself.
I know that from a personal standpoint, the sequester that was referenced meant 9 furlough days for every OMB employee, just to give you a sense of, how real that really was for especially a small agency like ours.
Crazy.
And the impact that that wound up having on morale and things like that obviously is pretty well documented. So I would just kind of add in almost from a personal standpoint, the real impact that those types of decisions can have on the ability for an organization to continue to deliver on mission.
Well, please join me in thanking this panel for their time and expertise.